Welcome to the first of our Kessler Conversations entitled Christian Ethics in Times of Plague. My name is Bo Adams, and I serve as the director of Pitts Theology Library, the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. One of the great traditions of Pitts Theology Library is our annual Reformation Day at Emory, which for the past 32 years has been an occasion for us to gather in the library for fellowship, worship, to learn about the Reformation, and to celebrate this incredible rare book collection, now North America's premier collection of printed books and manuscripts related to the reforms of Martin Luther and his colleagues, as well as the responses and ensuing debates of the 16th century. Clearly, the 33rd year of this event has to look a little bit different than it did for the first 32 years. Yet another time that the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted our lives. However, despite my great desire to see you all in person and conduct our regular Reformation Day programming, where I'll get the opportunity to show off the incredible acquisitions we've made this past year, I'm excited for the opportunity that this brings to offer our collection and our programming to new people that we can invite into our conversation. We have a lot of folks here who may not be familiar with the Kessler Collection, and I want to send them a special greeting. The pandemic gives us an opportunity to re-envision how we can answer the question that stands at the very core of the Kessler Collection, and that is, what relevance and impact do these 500-year-old works and debates hold for contemporary communities? That's the question that drives all of our acquisitions, our exhibitions, and our programming. Today's conversation is a perfect example of an attempt to answer that question of relevance. One cannot, of course, make it very long through the day without the interruptions of the pandemic coming to mind, whether that be in the form of masks or social distancing, or just the general unease and angst of this disease, not to mention the suffering and grief it has brought to so many. And so this fall, we thought we'd ask what relevance the Kessler Collection might have for all of us who are facing disease, death, and the challenge of pastoring in such frightful times. I'm thrilled to welcome today as our expert on this topic, Professor Anna Johnson of Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. Dr. Johnson is a renowned teacher and scholar of the Reformation. She's currently Associate Professor of Reformation Church History at Garrett. A PhD graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, she's the author of dozens of books, essays, articles, and reviews, including the 2017 monograph, Beyond Indulgences, Luther's Reform of Late Medieval Piety, 1518 to 1520, a book in which she draws close attention to Luther's early pastoral writings and argues that it was practical and pastoral concerns that were foundational for Luther's early theology and protest against the excesses of the church. Today, she joins us to talk about Christian ethics in the time of plague, helping us understand how Luther and the early Reformation responded to their own situations of disease and death, and how that might help us understand how we are to live in these challenging times. And so, Professor Johnson, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, particularly as I imagine you yourself are quite busy trying to figure out the challenges of teaching during a pandemic.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So before we jump right in, I just want to give a little bit of housekeeping on how this conversation will proceed. I'm going to ask a series of questions to Professor Johnson, and we'll have a conversation about this topic. But as you come up with your own questions, particularly as we move through the conversation, I encourage you to ask them, and you can do that through the Q&A tab that you see to the right of your screen. If you type your questions there, we will get them, and then as time affords at the end, I will ask some of those questions to Professor Johnson for her response. So with that aside, I want to begin the conversation, and I want to start with a really broad question, and that is simply, why do you study and teach the Reformation? And I'm particularly curious in the context of a Christian seminary in which you teach. As you prepare the next generations of pastoral leaders, why do you think it's important for them to know about events and figures from the 16th century?
Well, first of all, I study the Reformation because it's fascinating. It's a time when everything is changing and the shape of the new church is completely up in the air. Everybody's debating the best way to do things. And so you get this really vigorous debate about how things should be. What does the ideal church look like? And what does the ideal society look like? Because there are a lot of societal implications for the sorts of changes that are being suggested. For students, I think there are a number of ways that I think this can be important for their development, and especially I think as students who are going to be public figures, as pastors and community leaders. So one thing is to understand why things are the way they are. More recently, the late medieval and Reformation periods have been called the early modern period. And that the reason for that, even though it's sort of a more generic name, is that so much of what happened during this time shaped the modern world as we know it. And so, you get not only the birth of Protestantism, but also the birth of modern Catholicism. You also have the birth of colonialism and a new global economy that still has a lot of echoes today. It's the birth of the scientific revolution, the rise of nationalism in Europe. So all things that are really hallmarks of the modern world, and they're all intertwined. So to be able to, I think, engage this modern world and all of its complexities, I think you have to have some understanding of how all of those factors created that world. And I think secondly, despite the fact that it's, 400 to 500 years ago, there are still a striking number of similarities to the world of the 16th century and to our world. I think of this in terms of right now where the North American churches are. I think there's a similar sense of everything being sort of unsettled and changing, and sort of major questions in terms of what shape the church should take being just up in the air. And I think that can be overwhelming and maybe even sometimes hopeless. It's hard to know how we even start to figure out what steps we take when there are so many unknowns. So one of the advantages, I think, of studying the Reformation then is that we get to see how people who have gone before us have tackled these same sorts of questions in different contexts, but still, again, with quite a lot of similarities. And I think we start to realize maybe that this is just part of being human and part of being the church, which for me anyway reduces a little bit of the anxiety of like, oh no, we're facing something no one's ever faced before and we have to figure it out all by ourselves. I don't think that history gives these prepackaged suggestions, but we can see ways that others have approached them, and then take some of the sort of best ideas based on the context that they were in and the context that we're in, and see if we can find some wisdom in those. And then finally, I think for me, and this has come out especially in the pandemic, it's been helpful just to take courage from these people. It's often amazing and quite humbling what people were willing to sacrifice for their faith and for their convictions. And I think when we see those convictions and sacrifices close up, it can really put our own concerns in perspective and maybe encourage us to take a little bit of a longer view to pursue the things that are more important in life rather than the things that tend to grab our attention in the day-to-day.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing it. I want to talk about Luther in particular. And I was really interested in talking to you because, at least as I understand your work, you've in a sense worked to kind of rebrand Luther. And what I mean by that is, for many of us, at least for this librarian, I think about Luther as kind of this great reformer of institutions, as kind of an iconoclast in some sense, who saw abuses of the church and wanted to reform them or to remove them. But your work seems to focus on Luther's early writings, and particularly his pastoral work. And that presents a bit of a different view of Luther. You identify that even when Luther is decrying abuses of the church, it's pastoral concerns that are driving his reform. So can you tell us a little bit about Luther the pastor and Luther as a pastoral reformer as we kind of turn our eye to think about Luther in the context of disease?
Yeah, so I started looking at these pastoral works. They're written in German, and it was sort of a way to get at the Reformation from a different angle. The tendency for historians for centuries has been to study the so-called great men, and they are all men, but the major thinkers and their public acts and their writing, and especially when studying theologians, this almost always means reading their Latin writings because the big conflicts and academic works and the political dealings happen in Latin. But I became aware that Luther wrote an enormous amount in German, and that this has a much broader audience, obviously, because literacy rates for German were higher than they are for Latin. So it was intriguing me to think about what sort of impact this would have had on people, having this broader audience. And I noticed that early in his conflict with Rome, he wrote a large number of these pamphlets in German, and they're explaining essentially various aspects of the life of faith and then connecting that with this protest movement or this, this burgeoning conflict that he has with Rome. So what really emerged out of there is that I think his primary concern is not so much the sort of, big issues and even the issue of papal authority, but it's the concern about whether Christian faith is genuine in each individual. So genuine faith recognizes our need for grace, and then it trusts God to provide that grace. He's fighting against an understanding of faith where faith is just self-seeking. So for pursuing faith in order to get something or to earn something, That's not genuine because that's not trusting God for everything that we need. So in the famous example of indulgences, which of course is about the authority of the church and theological concepts and things, he sees people trying to basically get out of having genuine contrition for their sins by buying indulgences. And then furthermore, it's entirely self-seeking because their aim is to get out of hell, either for themselves or for their loved ones. So he sees, I think the fundamental problem that he sees there is that it sets up the relationship with God as one of bargaining and appeasing God and for our own self-interest, rather than one that recognizes our sin, understands the magnitude of God's grace that's given to us, and then from there allows us to trust and love God, and also in recognition of that love to turn and love our neighbors because God first loved us. So Luther takes these concerns to a number of other Christian practices: confession, prayer, Eucharist, even celibacy and marriage, and shows how late medieval piety often encourages Christians to do things to earn grace rather than recognize grace as a gift and then let that decide how one lives. So ultimately, he's against the Pope because the Pope is encouraging this sort of piety that sought to earn grace rather than receive grace. And then in doing that, the Pope is contradicting Scripture about our need for grace. And so the Pope is misleading the sheep who are in the Pope's flock and leading them toward inauthentic faith. So the pastoral Luther is not any less fierce than the reformer Luther. He feels very, very strongly about this and uses all of the colorful language that Luther is prone to use for it. But because he feels so passionately about it. So looking at that as the locus of his concerns.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, one of the reasons to study the Reformation is it's so interesting. And of course, Luther, as the fiery writer that he is, makes it a lot of fun just to read the stuff, even though if you weren't deeply interested in content. It's really interesting. I really like that you brought up the issue of language. I think one of the things that we often forget is that the early 16th century was a period of immense technological and cultural change, and language was just one part of that. We, of course, know that the printing press was only a few decades old at the time. And so to see Luther take advantage of these technological innovations and cultural changes to kind of reach a new audience and to make a new point, I think is a really, really important point to make. Thinking about pastoral issues, what for the common person, if you will, at the time, what were the major pastoral issues of the 16th century that someone would look to a pastor or a figure like Luther to help them reckon with on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think this issue of grace that I mentioned is it's a theological issue, but it's also a very practical issue, and it's maybe one where Lutherans think that it's a Lutheran thing. But really, everyone in the 16th century was concerned about grace. How much did you need of it? How to get it? What effect that grace has? And of course, it's necessary because everyone is sinful, and so there's a much more of a emphasis on sin. And one, I think that's kind of the flip side of grace, but something that I think in most North American societies we don't really pay that much attention to anymore. We don't talk about quite as much. I think questions of ethics and moral were also key, not only because of the relationship with grace and what sort of standing that put you in with God and what that did for your eternal fate, but also out of concern for society and in a sort of ideal society and how that functions. So in order for that society to function, there need to be certain rules, and the church was involved in helping create and sort of monitor those rules. And so pastoral writings often advise people on how to act in certain situations or how to encourage the right disposition. And a lot of reforms that we might think of as sort of devotional or reforms about piety have an ethical aspect to them as well. And then, of course, there's human experience and all the meaning that we give it. And humans then, as now, had the whole range of life experience. For 16th century Christians in particular, there's a lot of work on the role and meaning of suffering because there was so much more suffering than most of us experience today. So in the late Middle Ages, suffering was often considered either to be a punishment for sin or a good work that could earn grace. And Luther and other Protestants saw a logic of works righteousness in that. And instead, they encouraged Christians to trust in God's goodness, even in the midst of suffering, and sort of to accept the mystery there. But to turn that around a little bit from like a work that we can achieve to something that can help strengthen faith. And I know you're having Ron Rickers on in a couple of months, and I'm sure he'll talk more about that. So that's just a little bit of a preview. But it's a really important issue for the 16th century, and I think now.
That's right. November 4th, everybody come back for Ron Rickers to talk about the Reformation of suffering. Thank you for that plug. So I'm curious, as a historian who studies this period and someone who's kind of leading what it seems to be a kind of emerging or growing field of Luther and the Reformation and pastoral care, you've obviously probably had a unique perspective on the pandemic and what we've all been going through for the last 2 months. So how do you think about history in the time of the coronavirus?
Yeah, it's I've been a little bit surprised at how personal it has become for me. And especially I think by how much comfort I've derived from the knowledge of history and knowing that in the broad sweep of history, pandemics and epidemics have happened very regularly. So for me, just realizing that this is not actually unprecedented, even though we keep hearing news outlets say that so often, like realizing this is actually more normal than unprecedented has reminded me that, first of all, we're pretty fortunate in terms of the comfort of our lives and the amount of public health that we have, but also that our ancestors have gotten through many pandemics, and most of them with far fewer resources than we have. So I guess I have a sort of profound sense of of human resilience. And I think also a sense that we're not alone in this, that people who've gone before us have experienced this sort of thing and made it through. And I actually realized the other day that I've been not only thinking this way, but I've also actually been sharing it with my family, because the other night, one of my sons was rollerblading and hit a crack in the sidewalk, scraped his knee up pretty badly, and was kind of upset about it. But as he was calming down, then he said, other people have endured worse. So I think I apparently have been passing this lesson on to my family, and hopefully that will be a good thing and he won't need therapy for that later on or whatever. But in terms of Luther specifically, I think one thing that has really struck with me through this is his fierce trust in God and his conviction that no matter what happens, God wins in the end. I think people probably know this maybe most clearly from the lyrics to A Mighty Fortress. And this sort of just conviction that it is all going to be okay no matter what happens. And that's in part him feeling like he was probably going to be martyred for his cause, and so sort of being prepared for it. But I think that sort of clinging trust is all over his pastoral works as well. And I think it's the sort of thing that you can hear many times in many different ways, but still get something from it each time. I do think that sort of the ferocity of his faith, or the fierceness of his faith, can really help banish fear and put each risk that we face into a larger perspective.
Well, first of all, I have to compliment you on your 11-year-old son. To have that kind of historical perspective, a skinned knee is quite impressive for an 11-year-old.
Thank you.
I appreciate the mention of Mighty Fortress. One of the centerpieces of Reformation Day is always a stunning rendition of Mighty Fortress at our chapel. So many of us who come to Reformation Day probably have it going in our head right now. So Thank you for that. So Luther famously wrote a pamphlet that it seems quite relevant, entitled "Whether a Christian Should Flee a Plague." And I commend it to all of you. As I was telling Anna earlier, it's remarkable how on point it is for our own situation. So can you give us a little bit of sense of that particular work and summarize for us what Luther's argument is in kind of answering the question of whether a Christian should flee a plague?
Yeah. So this it was written at the request of a pastor in a different town where the plague had hit. And this seemed to be the main question, whether one can flee. So it's an ethical question. By the time Luther finished the work, the plague had hit Wittenberg as well. So it had a little bit more immediacy to it. So the question is, can I flee an infected city to preserve my own life, even if it means leaving behind other people who do not have the option of fleeing? And I think we saw this come up with the coronavirus real early, especially in New York City. There was this question about New Yorkers who had country homes fleeing to their country home because they wanted to get out of the city and the risk of being infected. And so So just to be clear, this question of whether one can flee is only a question for somebody at a certain social station in life who has a country home. But nonetheless, I think it is an important ethical question. And they didn't really understand the cause of the plague, which was a bacterium. They thought it was mostly caused by poor air quality, though they had some notion that people who were infected could transmit it. So the question is not primarily about the risk of spreading the plague if you flee the city, like it was in the case of New York, but instead about one's duties toward others, and then how much of a risk one is willing to take to be able to live out those duties. So there were some people who said no one should flee because they wouldn't fear death if they really trusted God, because God would decide whether they live or die. So it doesn't really matter what they do. So the argument there is basically that fleeing shows a lack of faith. Others saw no reason to stay in the city and endanger their lives, and wondered if that was from, that was from a lack of faith. That they wanted to flee. So Luther's response was to focus pretty pragmatically on the good and harm that might come out of either decision. And so what he said is, if people were responsible for others, either as a public official or a pastor, or if they had people working for them, they were obligated to stay and make sure that those other people that they had responsibilities for were cared for. But anyone who didn't have this sort of responsibility was free to decide whether to flee or not, that there was no risk or no need to risk their lives in order to prove their faith, that doesn't really do any good. So he focused the question entirely on how best to love one's neighbor in a plague, and then just made that the guiding principle. He also addressed, I think, some sort of interesting extreme forms of piety around the plague that have some resonances with the coronavirus as well. So he talks about some rumors that people have been exposing themselves to the plague on purpose. So I think coronavirus parties, right? In this case, though, it wasn't because they didn't, believe in the coronavirus or didn't think that would hurt them or whatever, but because it was a way to show that how strong their faith was. Or say some people might refuse to take medication because they say, well, if God wants to heal me, God will heal me, and medication or no medication. So even though Luther thought that Christians shouldn't fear death, he also thought that this was pretty careless, and that the sort of carelessness about the plague was merely tempting God. He says, well, by that logic, we could just not eat or drink, since God can preserve life without us taking food and water. But it's sinful to deny taking care of our bodies, right? And then also, in addition to that sin of tempting God, he thought that being careless about the plague was that much worse because it put other people's lives in danger. So again, it comes back to this real ethical issue, but I think that has a lot of resonance.
Yeah, and again, just to reemphasize the point, how much of this is on par? I mean, I was joking with someone earlier. They were clearly plague deniers at the time of Luther, just as we find today. And this idea of not trusting science or not trusting medicine because God is other, I think is quite a remarkable comparison between then and now. Can you give us a sense of how Luther argues? In the sense, what are the authorities for him? How does he ground his argument in answering this specific question?
In this particular case, it's a pretty simple sort of just starting with the second great commandment of, love your neighbor as yourself. So what does it mean to love one's neighbor is what promotes their well-being the most. So one needs to reckon with the threat of death in order to help somebody else. But that threat of death is a possibility, but one should not, open wide the door and let death in. So now in this particular piece, it's really mostly about this question of how do I help my neighbor, and what does it mean to help my neighbor responsibly in this very particular situation.
Mm-hmm. And in the latter part of the work, he turns and he says, I'm going to add some brief instructions on how one should care and provide for the soul at the time of death. So he seems to kind of broaden it out to a question about facing death in general. And I know that's a pretty common topic at the period, is kind of how do you prepare oneself for death? So can you tell us a little bit about how Luther talks about a fear of dying and how he kind of pastors people around that issue?
Yeah, so In this work, he talks about it mostly in these ethical terms. So to warn people not to let the fear of death keep them from caring for other people. So it's a little bit more distance. It's not, it's not actually in the moment of death as much. But there's, of course, an element of faith to it, because if someone with a stronger faith is facing this question, they're less likely to capitulate to the fear of death. But it's mostly from the standpoint of someone who's currently healthy and fears getting infected. There's another piece he wrote about 8 years earlier, where it's part of this whole late medieval genre of the art of dying. And it focuses more on the person on the deathbed and facing the fears and doubts and anxieties of being in that position. And there he's really talking about how to cling to God's promises of grace and life when all you can see in front of you is death. So in both cases, and he brings that out, I think, a little bit in this work as well on fleeing the plague, but in both cases, he assumes that we have a natural fear of death, just assumes that whenever we kind of come near death, that fear is going to come up. But also assumes that we need to be reminded that we really don't have reason to fear it, and that we have to sort of talk back to that fear by hearing the gospel of grace and being reminded of God's power to help shore up faith in these sorts of situations.
And I presume, as you mentioned earlier, death was much more of a reality for people living in this period than it seems to be for us, particularly in a Western context where the pandemic ushers in a little bit of that angst, but it certainly was more real for them. You also discussed earlier that one of the common topics was a question of the cause for sickness and suffering. Does Luther in this work or elsewhere address kind of why is this happening to us?
He does not. Let's see. I have to think. There are probably some points where he assumes that it's some sort of judgment, because that's one of the sort of standard interpretations of this time period. It's not the main emphasis, though. So that's my caveat. Is it might be in there somewhere. I don't remember seeing it the last time.
We won't ask you to represent the entire Luther corpus. So
all right. Yeah, I think he's much less. I mean, he does use that idea that sometimes, and especially sort of society-wide things, are a punishment from God for sin, or as an attempt to sort of get people's attention and listen to God more. He's much less likely to use that sort of lens of interpretation when he's talking to an individual who's suffering. So that's one way in which I think he's very pastoral when speaking with individuals who are suffering. He does not seem to think that it's useful to explore with them what sin they might have committed that makes God angry at them. It's much more about providing comfort and hope and promise to the individual. In general, though, I think in this piece on the plague, he does not assume to know why it's happening, but just assumes that it matters how we respond to it, that's the real question, not to figure out why it's happening, but to figure out what to do about it.
Right. Can you, to kind of zoom out from this work, if you kind of had to summarize what can we as maybe pastoral leaders or just as lay people who are facing a pandemic, what can we learn from Luther? How do we kind of interpret what he says to his audience in 1527 to an audience in 2020?
I think there are a lot of things that people of faith can learn from the work. And again, I would encourage people to read it because it is a fairly easy read, or, it's not like most 16th century works in a lot of ways. And I think different people will be struck by different things. So I guess I'll say for myself that I've read the work many times and I tend to find something new in it each time. During this pandemic, I think the emphasis on shifting one's focus from the fear of death to concern for others has had particular resonance for me. I think particularly early on in the pandemic, when no one really knew what this was going to look like, and there was just a sort of like cloud of, of what's coming. I think it was helpful for me to think about ways that I can sort of get outside of my own sort of fear of death and keep it from sort of sinking its claws into me and just holding me there. And I think this emphasis that Luther has about think about your role in larger society, think about who needs you and what good you can do and how you can share the love of God in larger society, rather than sort of just being stuck in your own fear of death. And I think that's like there's sort of a vicious cycle, and then whatever the opposite of a vicious cycle is. So I think when we can pull ourselves out of the vicious cycle of worrying about death and worrying about what might happen and start looking toward others, I think it really can reinvigorate faith, because it reminds us of the vocations that we each have and the ways that those vocations fit into the larger purposes of Christian life, which is so much bigger and more enduring than physical death. And so once I can see beyond that fear of death, then I think faith gains more power. So that's one aspect. I think another aspect of the work that I keep thinking about is a detail that actually isn't in the text. It's not something Luther talks about, but it's part of the background of Luther's biography. So Luther himself is dealing with the plague in Wittenberg at this time, and he and his family took in plague patients into their house. They live in the former Augustinian monastery, and so they've got a lot of space, and he's his community leader, so they take in plague patients as needed. And during that time, his wife was pregnant, and at that time, their only child was not very old. I think in like a year and a half or 2 years, something like that. And both his wife and his child were infected with the plague. And in fact, the baby that his wife was carrying was never really healthy and died before she turned 8 months old. And quite possibly, we don't know, of course, but quite possibly because of the fact that her mother was exposed to the illness during the pregnancy. So to me, it's not a situation where Luther's like standing on high and telling everyone else what to do from a safe distance. But so back to this idea of sort of gaining courage from historical figures and what they were willing to risk for their convictions. I've had to, as I think through that in this sort of mindset that the pandemic has put many of us in, I'm not sure that I could say that I would have had the courage to take in COVID patients if it came to it, if it were necessary. And I'm really pretty sure that I would have declined that responsibility if I were pregnant, just to not take that risk. So I think thinking about that aspect of Luther's stories, for me, put all the more mundane risks of COVID in perspective, and challenged me to think about my own fear of death and the strength of my faith. So essentially, after contemplating what Luther wrote and what he was going through, going to the grocery store to get some food seemed like much less of a big deal.
Well, I think that's so important. I mean, we think about these great towering figures of someone like Luther that we know only through his writings, right? You don't realize, or you don't think about the fact that he was also a husband and a father and dealing with all of these things. And he was a local pastor who had these, not obligations, but this certain call to take care of people. So I appreciate you bringing in the biography there. That's something I think I at least often overlook.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question as a librarian now. So this is very much a selfish question. We are a library that collects lots of old original printings of Luther. And we pride ourselves. We're nearing 4,000 works from 1501 to 1570 related to the Reformation. And that's a lot of stuff, and it costs a lot of money, and it's a lot of work to collect. So I'm curious, as a scholar of this period, can you help us understand why it's important to collect and to use these original works as opposed to, we can all go to Google and find this piece and read it online. Why is it important for a library to do what we do?
Yeah, good question.
I hope you have a good answer, by the way. Otherwise, we're in trouble.
I think I have a decent answer. So original texts are essential to historical research because every generation has its own lens and its own set of questions that it brings to the text. And so what each generation of historians are doing is going back to the original text with a different set of questions. So we need to have that sort of broad set of original text so that, the interpretation of people from 1950 is not the last word on things. If everyone decided that it wasn't worth it to keep storing all of these items in 1950 and we were just going to sort of, write the definitive volume and chuck the rest of the stuff, then we don't get to go back to those sources and ask our own questions. So the Kessler collection and libraries like that are so important because they preserve a much wider range of texts than edited volumes can. As much time and money and effort as it takes to keep those texts in a rare book room, it's a lot of money and time and effort and expertise also to create an edited volume. So what we have in an edited volume is a very small slice of historical texts. So it gives us then a very limited perspective from which to engage history. So, for example, this Luther text that we've been talking about, Whether One Could Flee from a Deadly Plague, is in critical editions of Luther's works because Luther is well known. But the Kessler collection also has a piece by Andreas Osiander, a reformer, another 16th century reformer from Nuremberg, by almost the same title. So dealing again with this question of whether one may flee the deadly plague. And it's written after Luther's. So, it can give some insights into whether Luther influenced his work, if it's quite similar, or what sort of divergences he takes from Luther, if it's quite different. Or just other ways that reformers approach the plague, maybe competing ideas about what someone should do in the case of the plague. So I think getting that broader view could really fleshes out then what we know about this period and the sorts of resources, and then it changes the sorts of questions we can ask as well. If we know more about what a broader range of people think, not just sort of the main big figures, then we can start to put together much more of sort of history as it was lived versus history completely from the top down, which is what you get when you only have those main characters. I think the other thing for me personally, archives have been very important for my work. And one of the ways that these rare book collections really can help us interpret history is because it preserves the notes that readers have written on them. So mostly marginal writings. And we get some sense of then how various readers have engaged these texts. And this was essential for me because some of those marginal comments actually led me to my dissertation topic, which then became my book, Beyond Indulgences. I was early in my research and not really sure what direction I wanted to go. So I just sort of went to the Princeton University Rare Book Room and took all of the Luther texts that I could find and sat down and read them. And it was really striking to me that a lot of the works that were sort of cited in the textbooks about Luther as being, his main writings, they had them and I could read them, but from the looks of it, nobody had ever read them because they had very few marginal notes, right? And then I get into these vernacular pastoral texts, and there's writing all over the margins, notes and biblical cross-references and sort of main ideas. And there's like a little drawing sort of dingbat that they do of like a hand pointing to like something that they really want to highlight. So you get the sense of how important these texts were to readers. You can tell from the handwriting what era these readers were in. So you get some sense of the influence that these texts actually had in their own time. And you can really see that these are not coffee table books that people bought to put out to show that they were on Luther's side. These were books that people engaged and apparently got something from. So that made those sources that much more important to highlight in terms of telling the story of the Reformation. And like most interesting discoveries, I stumbled into it, but I would not have been able to stumble into it if there weren't rare book collections that just had these things that people can stumble into.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of irony, right, that Luther adopts the form of the pamphlet so that he can more widely distribute some of his works, but then those works are more readily used by people and therefore are more ephemeral and therefore more difficult to collect these days, right? Yeah. But finding the marginalia on them, I think, certainly gives you a different perspective. And you and I were talking about that Osiander piece you mentioned has marginalia written all over it from a very different period, but offers a very kind of different perspective on how the text was used and read, I think in that case in the 19th century. So I think you've made the case that libraries should stick around and we should collect this stuff.
I hope so.
Thank you for that. Well, we could go on for hours, of course. I want to be conscious of everyone's time, and I want to get to a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A. And just to kind of group them all maybe into one question for us to have time, can you talk a little bit about Luther as a pastor? Or what would a pastor have done in this particular period? How hands-on would he have been? You mentioned taking people into his homes. Was he actively pastoring a community?
So yeah, he preached very frequently. That was sort of his main pastoral task. And it came out of the role that he had in within his Augustinian community. So he was often preaching in the Augustinian church, but then for a while, When Wittenberg was without a pastor, then he was one of the main pastors there. So he preached, several times a week. It was sort of crazy, the workload that he had. Sometimes he'd preach in the castle church if the elector wanted him to be preaching there. And then he also did a series of sermons at his own home. So later in his, in his life, when it's no longer this monastery. So his major activity in a lot of ways was through preaching, but he also, because he was such a public figure, he maintained a very broad correspondence. And a lot of that correspondence was really sort of pastoral questions, theological and pastoral questions. But a lot of it, it's fascinating to read just because he is so intimately engaged with these individuals and what they're going through and how they're experiencing this new theology. There are a couple, I believe. So Tappert has a volume of Luther's letters I think it's called Spiritual Counsel or something like that. So if people want to read that, that's a great bedtime table read, honestly. And then in terms of, reforming various practices, he's suggesting the ways that things should be changed so that people experience the faith in a particular way. So I would list all of that under pastoral as well.
Mm-hmm. So I have to ask this question because it was asked by Scott Hendricks, so you'll have to answer it. He asked, could you say a little bit more about how Luther handled the notion of the plague as punishment?
So if you don't know, Scott Hendricks was my dissertation advisor. So this is like my dissertation exam all over again. I'm having flashbacks. Let's see. I'm trying to remember what I said before about it. And I'm just getting nervous because it's my dissertation advisor.
Well, you mentioned that there was a general idea that there was punishment, that suffering was the result of God's punishment. And maybe in this work, he doesn't particularly address that. That doesn't seem to dwell on that as an explanation.
Yeah. So there is a sense of punishment. I think he's very hesitant to name exactly what the sin might be or exactly what God's message is through it. But I think through any sort of trial or temptation or something, Luther feels like that's an opportunity to strengthen faith. And so if we take it as sort of maybe not punishment but chastisement, that maybe we need to focus a little bit more on, or it's an opportunity to exercise faith by having that faith be tested, and therefore calling on us to sort of reignite this faith that we have in God's goodness, and in sort of just putting one foot in front of the other and while we figure out what to do. I don't know what grade I got on that answer.
I'm sure you did great. So I'm gonna call us at time here. And first of all, thank you, Professor Johnson, for your conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and I think I'm sure everyone else here did as well. Let me just ask one little tiny question at the end. If you could offer one resource to our community here to learn more about the Reformation, to learn more about Luther, or to learn more about his response in this situation, what book or website or resource would you offer?
I'm not just saying that because I know now that Scott Hendricks is on the line, but there's a great series by Oxford University Press called Very Short Introductions. And what I love about them is that they're small. They're like smaller than a cell phone. So I almost always have one of them in my purse in case I am at the dentist and have to wait forever. I've got something interesting to read. But Scott Hendricks wrote the Oxford Very Short Introductions for Luther. So I think it's just called Martin Luther. But a very concise and helpful overview that just sort of gets you into Luther's way of thinking and the worldview that he inhabited, as well as a good sense of the influence that he had. And I'm not just saying that so that I bring up my earlier grade.
I agree with you. It's a good work. So that's Oxford University Press, a very short introduction to Luther. So thank you for that recommendation. So I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to remind you that this is the first of a series of conversations that we're doing this fall on this very topic. So in a month, we're going to have Eric Hendricks, who is a historian of this period, but focuses on medicine and plague in this period. So he can give us a little more about the medical context in which Luther is operating. And then, as Professor Johnson mentioned, Ronald Riggers will be with us in November to talk about the idea of the Reformation of suffering and the ways in which, in the Reformation period, figures approached physical, emotional, and spiritual suffering. We hope you'll join us for these. You can register for all of them at pitts.emory.edu/Kessler Conversations. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you for your time, and I hope you stay safe out there. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.